sound like I might have done a better job than me. Good evening, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, and eminent speakers. My name is Masi Homayuni. I represent the Center for International Research, Understanding, and Security. CIRUS is a private, independent, non-for-profit organization based in New York, dedicated in advancing cooperation between nations and promoting active international dialogue towards global peace and security. On behalf of CIRUS and the Arab Student Association and Iranian students at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, I want to thank all of you for attending this evening's panel discussion, The Treaty of Nuclear Nonproliferation, Theory versus Practice, the case with Iran's nuclear program. The gathering here tonight is unique in that we have with us so many distinguished guests, ambassadors, policymakers, scholars, and representatives of the media. Also with us are extraordinary students who've made this assembly achievable. I specifically want to emphasize the importance of why we have chosen Columbia University for this venue. Not only is Columbia University one of the world's most renowned academic institutions, but it is located in one of the most important cities in the world. And the students sitting here with us today represent all four corners of the globe. Whether they are present here with us, or whether they are being presented while sitting somewhere in Africa, the Middle East, in Asia, in Europe, or indeed every corner of our planet. They represent our next leaders, our next presidents, prime ministers, ambassadors, policymakers, physicists, writers, and journalists. They are our hope. They are our seeds of hope and seeds of peace, and to them we owe the truth beyond propaganda and distortion of facts. In a world filled with conflicts, wars, devastation, and poverty, we turn to you, our future generation, our students from all walks of life, scholars in the world of academia, where there are no borders, no differences that separate us from one another. In fact, the discussion today will directly impact one of their own, students and scholars in one particular country, Iran, as a new United Nations Security Council draft resolution aims to punish Iran for its nuclear enrichment program. The draft contains language that would target Iranian students by prohibiting certain types of specialized teaching or training of Iranians. The passage of academic prohibition provision could prevent Iran's best and brightest from gaining access to international institutions of higher learning and scientific knowledge. As such, not only is the timing of this venue appropriate, but so is its location in an academic environment of the highest standing. No doubt the gathering in this forum is familiar with the NPT, a treaty which was negotiated for signature in 1968, when only 5 states, the United States, the former Soviet Union, France, China, and Great Britain, the P5, had nuclear weapons. The 187 states that signed on to that treaty did so with the assumption that those 5 states, or the 2 superpowers, the United States and the former Soviet Union, would protect them and stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons. Let me pause here for a moment. Iran was the first signatory to the NPT agreement in 1968. Today, the NPT has become a Cold War relic. At the end of the Cold War in 1991, the US became the sole superpower with an unchallenged power. America's rise to absolute power also enabled it to enforce the NPT at its whim. The world has witnessed that while countries such as South Korea, Brazil, and Egypt, who have violated the NPT, in addition to non-NPT nuclear armed members, India, Pakistan, and Israel remain allies of the US and receive aid, Iran has been condemned for pursuing its inalienable right. Since 2003, reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, have indicated that there is no indication of undeclared material or of a nuclear weapons program by Iran. On April 28, the IAEA released its report on Iran. The agency cannot make a judgment about or reach a conclusion on future compliance or intentions. The US has been accusing Iran of trying to develop nuclear weapons, and Iran has been insisting that its intentions are peaceful, and that as a signatory to the NPT, it is the right to nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. As you're aware, deliberations are currently underway by the P5+1 to submit Iran's dossier to the United Nations Security Council for a resolution under Chapter 7, Article 41 of the Charter of the United Nations, stipulating a threat to peace, subjecting Iran to economic, diplomatic, and political sanctions, and potential military strikes. Any confrontation between the US and Iran seriously harms the national interests of both countries, the world, and the Middle East, a vital region in dire need of peace and security. What is it about Iran that finds it atop of headlines persistently year after year, decade after decade? What is it about Iran that finds it such an intractable problem? What does history tell us about Iran, about Persia? Iran that wants to develop a nuclear weapon, Iran that is the scourge, the axis of evil, Iran the blot upon the landscape of the world, or Iran the tremendous possibility for peace across the world, the conceivable solution to the many things that the West finds most difficult, the distinction, the understanding that this is a civilization of enormous importance, of profound antiquities, and of profound development passes most people by. We have been told for over 20 years that Iran is an exclusively, uniquely an Islamic country, and a country with only one focus. Iran is much richer, more complex than what we are ever normally allowed to think. If we do want to have a lasting peace in the Middle East, a secure basis of peace in the Middle East, this has to involve Iran at its center. And if we are not to be bewildered by the current events, then we need to try to understand more about the complex, rich history of Iran that pulls so many threads of its past together into its present. Further, if we want to have an intellectual discourse, it must be based on facts and not based on our wishes. With Iraq and Afghanistan, Lebanon, Palestine in chaos, do we need a new confrontation in the Middle East? What is it about Iran that the US finds so threatening? Are we reliving Iraq all over again? What are the reasons and motives behind US accusations? What is the difference between Iran and countries such as Argentina, Brazil, Israel, Pakistan, India, France, the United Kingdom, US, China, and Russia? Which one of these countries has abided by the NPT? How can the spirit of the NPT be salvaged and not be used as a political tool? Leading us to our discussion, I have the unique honor of introducing His Excellency, Dr. Javad Zarif, Iran's ambassador to the United Nations. Ambassador Zarif has been a career diplomat for 12 years at Iran's mission to the UN. In the past 2 decades, he has played a key role in the UN, the non-aligned movement, and the organization of the Islamic Conference. Most recently, he was appointed by the UN Secretary General as a member of the group of eminent persons on dialogue among civilizations. Ambassador Zarif serves on the board of editors of a number of scholarly journals and has written extensively on disarmament, human rights, international law, and regional conflicts. Also with us this evening is the renowned former UN's weapons inspector, Mr. Scott Ritter. Mr. Ritter served as the top UN's weapons inspector in Iraq between 1991 and 1998. Before working for the UN, he served as an officer in the US Marines and as a ballistic missile advisor to General Schwarzkopf in the First Gulf War. He's the author of numerous books, including Iraq Confidential, Endgame, Frontier Justice, and his most recent book, Target Iran. Mr. Ritter has recently returned from a trip to Iran, and this evening he will share with us his direct experience as he traveled throughout Iran, speaking with ordinary citizens, governmental officials, Iran's military personnel, revolutionary guards, as well as visiting Iran's nuclear facilities. Your Excellency, the audience is yours.
I think it is pertinent when our world and our region is undergoing a tumultuous time to begin by invoking the name of God in our religious terminology, which has in it the expressions of compassion and mercy. The subject for our discussion tonight has been the NPT in theory and practice and the case of Iran. So let me start by making a few comments about the NPT and about how Iran can, in fact, strengthen the NPT. Most of you who have done work on this area know that the NPT was the result of a bargain that was based on an assumption that nuclear weapons were dangerous, that nuclear weapons should not remain as a weapon of war, but as an interim measure, nuclear weapons should not be spread. That is why NPT was based on three fundamental pillars. And here I'm simply quoting the three pillars of the NPT. And they are nuclear disarmament, non-proliferation, and peaceful use of nuclear energy. Nuclear disarmament is an important pillar of the NPT, and that is why NPT had a 25-year lifespan, because people were not prepared to accept a permanent possession of nuclear weapons by anybody. Those who signed the treaty and those who ratified the treaty, bringing into force in 1971, believed that nuclear weapons were an anomaly, that the use of nuclear weapons under whatever circumstances were illegal, were harmful to humanity, could not be tolerated. And that is why they gave the treaty a 25-year lifespan, so that after 25 years they could come back and revisit whether the international community could continue to live under the nuclear nightmare. Now, in 1995, with pressure from the Western countries, the NPT was extended indefinitely, while the demands of non-aligned countries for a time-bound commitment from the nuclear weapon states on when they are going to finally dismantle the weapons went unheeded. But nevertheless, the original intention of the NPT did not go anywhere. That remains a solid part of the NPT, and unfortunately, very little progress has been achieved in that area. And I just wanted to finish this segment by making a comment based on the decision of the International Court of Justice in an advisory opinion, which, although did not, to my chagrin, rule out the use of nuclear weapons as illegal, I spent 90 minutes before the International Court of Justice arguing why the use of nuclear weapons under any pretext would be a violation of international law. I stand by that argument any time, because I believe nuclear weapons under any circumstances, the use of them would become a crime against humanity. But nevertheless, the court decided, being a political body, in addition to a judicial body, the court decided that negotiations in good faith to bring about nuclear disarmament was a legal obligation of the nuclear weapon states. And that is why I agree with Ms. Humayuni that the 5 nuclear weapon states, namely the United States, Russia, China, France, and the United Kingdom, are in violation of not only the terms of the NPT for disarmament, but of an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, which binds them to pursue good faith negotiations for nuclear disarmament. Unfortunately, all we see is the horizontal and vertical expansion, particularly vertical expansion of nuclear weapons in terms of weapon systems that can be used tactically and strategically. The other two pillars of the NPT have important ramifications for Iran, and the way the Iranian case is dealt with has important ramifications for those two pillars of the NPT, namely non-proliferation and peaceful access to technology. It is important to understand that international treaties, international regimes, must have important balance between obligations and rights in order to be sustained. You cannot sustain an international regime through pressure. Pressure may compel one party or the other to abide and to comply, but they will not sustain international treaties. What will sustain international regimes is an inherent balance which make it, in fact, advantageous for members to continue to submit themselves to the requirements, to the restrictions, to the obligations that come along with membership in the treaty. And those advantages are that if you're a member of the treaty, you enjoy possibilities which you would not enjoy as a non-member. Now look at the situation today. If you're not a member of the NPT, to quote my colleague Ambassador Bolton, you can legitimately pursue nuclear weapons. He made that statement on the record about the pursuit of nuclear weapons by the 3 states that are not party to the NPT. Therefore, if you did not make yourself committed to the provisions on non-proliferation, you have a free hand. You can even enjoy treaties of cooperation in the nuclear field. I think that is the most dangerous concept that could not only endanger the NPT, but destroy it altogether, because it destroys the inherent balance between rights and obligations of non-nuclear member states in the NPT. And that is why Iran's insistence on its rights is not only important for Iran in terms of national pride, in terms of Iran being able to advance in the area of science and technology, but it is important for the longevity of the treaty itself. Without a balance between rights and obligations, the treaty is bound to fail. And that is why it is important for all of us, for anybody who is interested in the non-proliferation regime, to insist that countries who are members of the NPT can enjoy the rights that are associated with membership. And countries that are not members of the NPT would be limited, at least in the area of cooperation in nuclear research. The same goes true for other disarmament conventions. The only thing that can keep, for instance, the Chemical Weapons Convention together is that members of the Chemical Weapons Convention would have access to chemical technology and chemical materials, and non-members would be restricted from having access to chemical technology and material. These are inherent in these treaties. And unfortunately, none of these obligations are being observed by Western powers. The only criteria, the only yardstick that is being applied is not compliance with these treaties, but rather the nature of bilateral relations and multilateral relations between specific target countries and certain countries in the West. Then we get to the issue of non-proliferation. Non-proliferation is the third pillar of the NPT. And it seems to me, as somebody who is devoted to non-proliferation, whether in my academic life as well as in my political and diplomatic life, that the most important aspect of the Iranian nuclear program, the most important aspect of the way the international community deals with the Iranian nuclear program, is to see whether the way we deal with this program strengthens the non-proliferation aspects of the NPT or weakens them. Now, how do you strengthen the non-proliferation aspects of a treaty? How do you strengthen the non-proliferation mechanisms? Through sanctions, through pressure, or through advancing possibilities for non-proliferation? These are the questions that must be addressed when you want to address the Iranian nuclear program. Now, let me, with this preface, just basically throw at you some background about Iran's nuclear program. And I'll try to be very brief so that at least in the remainder of my time we can get to some of your comments and questions. Iran has many natural resources, but Iran's economy has been dependent on being an energy exporter. Iran cannot tolerate a situation when it can become an importer of energy. And that is why in 1974, a US research institute presented to the former Shah of Iran that Iran's energy mix must include nuclear energy in order for it to be a sustained energy mix. This conclusion, which usually US government officials put aside as the advice of a research institute, was confirmed by the State Department in a memo dated October of 1978, in which it welcomed Iran's intention to diversify its sources of energy. Because in reality, Iran can become a net importer of energy within the next 2 to 5 decades, depending on whose numbers you want to look at. But in the near future, in the next generation or two, Iran, unless it develops very extensive alternative sources of energy, will become dependent on energy as an importer of energy. And that is not sustainable for Iranian economy. Although the country is trying to reduce its dependence on oil as a means of attracting foreign currency, but nevertheless, we need to be realistic. That remains an important part of Iran's future and Iran's economic future. Therefore, in 1974, when the Shah of Iran was basically the poster boy of US nuclear industry, started investing in nuclear technology. Immediately after the revolution, all our contracts were canceled. Now, it's interesting for you to know that they are telling Iran that we will consider today, I mean, the generous package that you've heard about, talks about considering possibilities for cooperation in the area of nuclear technology. Considering possibilities. Now, they're saying that we will promise you to negotiate with you the provision of a nuclear reactor to Iran. But you know that they had a solid contract with Iran, with Siemens, and it unilaterally abrogated it in 1980, right after the revolution, and nothing has happened to Siemens even. Siemens has even failed to pay compensation for breaking that agreement with Iran. You know that they're saying that Iran can rely on outside sources of fuel. But they're not telling you that Iran owns outside sources of fuel. Now they're suggesting to us that we will promise you that we will give you fuel. But they're forgetting the fact that not only we don't need their promises, we own the fuel. We own fuel in the United States. We own fuel in Germany. We own fuel elsewhere. We also own 10% share in a fuel fabrication and manufacturing conglomerate called Eurodif. Iran owns 10% of that company. It's an Iranian, Italian, French conglomerate. And you know, we have not been able to get 1 gram of the uranium which we produce. That has been the story of Iran's nuclear program. Immediately after revolution, based on political considerations, every agreement with Iran was cut. Every agreement with Iran was abrogated, and nobody cared about it. They simply left Iran to its own device. Probably the Bushehr nuclear reactor will go in history or in the Guinness Book of Records as the longest project in probably nuclear industry. Iran started it in the 70s, and now they're talking about the 2007 completion. They were talking about the 2006 completion, now 2007, and who knows what. And if the designs of the US government which erroneously tells everybody that they are interested and are okay with Iran's Bushehr facility these days. If you leave it to their device, they will make sure that in the current resolution, the Russians will be prevented either from completing the nuclear reactor or from providing fuel to the nuclear reactor. This is how the resolution is framed. This presented Iran with a choice, either to say, yes, sir, we submit. This is your right to decide what we can have and what we cannot have, and simply said we will go and look for other sources of energy. Let's forget about nuclear energy. That was one choice. But if we wanted to make that choice, we should have made it in every single scientific area. Because this restriction is not limited to nuclear technology. The same restriction applies to civil aviation. For the last 27 years, Iran has not been able to buy a single Western-made airplane. Although we are a rich country, we can afford it. But we haven't been able to buy a single Western-made airplane. Now, they have made a lot of noise about allowing Iran to buy spare parts. But let me tell you what spare parts they are. These are parts that if they're not sold to Iran, if they're not going to sell them to Iran. They are going to take our planes to another country and then fix the engines, because if they didn't, it would cause, and I'm quoting Nick Burns, Undersecretary of State, they would cause catastrophic failure, which would mean planes would blow up in the air. That is the type of spare parts that they're selling us, even after they make this grandiose announcement that the US is interested in resolving its differences with the Iranian people and not putting the Iranian people in jeopardy. This is the type of concession that has been made to Iran after 27 years. The same would apply to chemical industry, to biological industry, to any area of industry, from mine clearing, because you know that Iranian territory was infested with a lot of mines during the Iraq War, which, should I remind anybody, received the support of the United States and every single Western country, not to mention others, when Saddam invaded Iraq. Iran is infested with a lot of mines. Nobody is selling Iran one single mine-sweeping machine in order for us to sweep the mines that were left in the Iranian territory. So if we wanted to submit to the demand that we should not have looked for nuclear energy, that would not have been the end of the story. The story of Iran's pursuit of science and technology in the past 27 years has been a story of trying to build our own technology based on whatever you want to call it. Borrowing the technology from others and copying it, trying to develop our own technology, but that has been our story. Most of it has been, we have been forced to do most of it in less than transparent way, because the minute we exposed our program, however legitimate that program was, and all of it was purely legitimate and peaceful, all of our supplies would be cut off. That is the story of Iran's lack of transparency. Denial would lead to lack of transparency, because the other option is non-existent for Iran. The other option is submission and acceptance of backwardness. And that, I do not believe any Iranian is ready to take. So forced into a corner, Iran went to the black market, paid a few extra dollars, bought the equipment, then reverse engineered it, and now thanks to these restrictions, we own all of that technology. We produce our own, we build our own, we develop the scientific infrastructure for our own technology, and that is what today Iran has. Not because we had ulterior motives, but today Iran has an indigenous chemical industry, an indigenous biological industry, an indigenous genetic industry, an indigenous nanotechnology, an indigenous cloning technology. Everything, we've had to do it ourselves. That has its difficulties. It may not be the best technology. Some people may call our centrifuges obsolete, but they are ours. Nobody can prevent us from building more. So Iran has come to this stage of being able to produce its own technology because of the restrictions that have been imposed on Iran. Now, this technology is sensitive technology, and we understand it. But this technology is required for Iran in order to be able to sustain its huge investment in the area of nuclear energy. Because we cannot rely on the same terms of agreement that we've had before, which would make us dependent on the rest of the world, on the West, or anybody else for that matter, for giving us what we need to operate this industry. Now, how to deal with that? Now, one way is just wishful thinking, hoping that by imposing pressure on Iran, Iran would submit and abandon the technology. But is it even realistic to say that? Now, it's not the case like some other countries. Some people want to tell us that Iran should copy that other country, that simply put its nuclear centrifuges in a ship and sent them to Tennessee, and everybody had a sigh of relief. The technology in Iran did not come in ships. The technology did not come in boxes. The technology, the nuclear technology in Iran came in used equipment. And that is why a couple of years ago you heard about high levels of contamination in Iran as if Iran had the bomb. But they had come from a place which already had built a bomb, and residues of the uranium that had been enriched in that country were left on these machines, and that is why when they came to Iran, they showed the contamination. Iran bought these used, basically junk stuff, and through reverse engineering, built its own centrifuges. This technology exists in the minds of our population, of our scientists, and we have a large number of them. Now, one way of dealing with that, and although it may seem eccentric, but it has been proposed, is to get rid of these scientists. And if you go and read Israeli papers, this suggestion has been made, to get rid of the scientists. The other way, which is not only the more humane way, but the more practical way, is to make sure that this technology is used purely for peaceful purposes. And if that is the objective, if the objective is not to simply tell Iran what it can and cannot do, if the objective is not to find excuses to put pressure on your adversaries, if the objective is to strengthen the non-proliferation regime, then Iran has put on the table so many suggestions based on serious research by independent scholars that would, from a legal perspective, from a political perspective, as well as from a technical and monitoring perspective, make it next to impossible for Iran to divert this technology to non-peaceful uses. These suggestions included, for instance, permanent presence of IAEA inspectors, which goes beyond even the additional protocol, on Iranian territory on the sensitive sites, so that they could ensure that nothing would be done on these sites that would be a violation of the NPT. Other suggestions have been made. Iran presented packages to the European three when we were negotiating about the so-called objective guarantees. Iran presented packages to the European three that would have, in all possibilities, prevented diversion. Now, they did not come back and tell us that your package requires this additional element. I'm telling you as somebody who negotiated with the Europeans until 2005. They did not. They never came back and told us that if you added 2 more inspections, we would be fine with that. Never. They simply said that you are not reliable enough to have this technology. Now, where does that reliability come from? Does it come from the fact that Iran has not invaded another country for 250 years? Now, we have countries that have access to extremely sensitive nuclear technology with a record of invasion, aggression in their recent history. We have countries that have access to nuclear technology who have used it. We have countries who have access to nuclear technology that have, let's take any criteria, violations of human rights, state terrorism, non-compliance with the Security Council. Apply each single one of these characteristics and criteria to Israel and see if Israel should have nuclear weapons. Now, Iran is not trying to have nuclear weapons. Iran simply wants to have restricted nuclear technology for peaceful purposes. And they simply say, you're not reliable. And when we tell them that we have tested you and you are even less reliable, let us find a criteria other than what you and I can simply say, this is my prerogative to not trust you. Find a criteria, objective criteria, based on which we can work and strengthen the NPT. Let me conclude by saying that for Iran, NPT is extremely important. We live in a dangerous neighborhood. Now, when India and Pakistan exploded their nuclear device in the mid-90s, there was a suggestion that Iran should get out of the NPT. But you know, instead what Iran did? Our foreign minister went to Geneva, to the Conference on Disarmament, and he officially called for universalization of the NPT. Because we define our national security interest in terms of non-proliferation. We believe that not only pursuit of nuclear weapons for Iran does not provide Iran with reliable deterrence, it will reduce our security, it will augment our vulnerability. And if anybody is interested, I can discuss that in the question and answer period. So it is important for us to strengthen the NPT. What we're saying to members of the Security Council is that you're certainly going the wrong way. What you're doing will simply detract from the NPT, undermine the NPT, and finally push it into irrelevance by making respect for the NPT as a problem rather than an advantage. We need to strengthen the NPT by allowing countries who are signatories and implementing the NPT to have access to the technology, and at the same time, by making sure that they do not develop nuclear weapons. And that could only be done through cooperation, through inspection, and through verification, if that is the objective. The question is whether the objective is to strengthen the NPT or whether the NPT is simply a tool for pressure, as many other issues. Thank you.
So thank you for being here. So we started this panel with the question, what is about Iran that makes it so different? What is about Iran that makes it such a threat for us? And I think that to answer that question, we need you to answer, to let us know whether we should take the Iranian president seriously. When he say about another country, a member of the UN like you, that it should be erased from the map. When he denied the Holocaust. When he just said last week that this country, the end of this country is really close. When he's not only talking, but sponsor and train terror organizations such as Hezbollah and Hamas. So if we should take him seriously, when we hear that, there is a threat, and there is something different than every other country. Thank you.
Long before President Ahmadinejad was elected, long before he was even elected mayor of Tehran, Israeli officials were making threats of use of military force against Iran. Shaul Mofaz, the defense minister of Israel, went on the Persian language Israeli radio and said, if we attack Iran, this is December of 2004, he said, if we attack Iranian nuclear facilities, we'll make sure that civilian casualties will be minimal. Then, only last week, the deputy defense minister of Israel said, the use of force against Iran is the last option, but it may be the only option. Now, let's go a bit higher. Shimon Peres, the deputy prime minister of Israel, somebody who is not known for his radical views, I'm not quoting Mr. Lieberman or anybody, I'm quoting Shimon Peres. He said in March of this year that Iran can also be wiped out from the face of the earth. Now, threats and counter-threats between Iran and Israel have gone on, and Israelis started it in the time when Iranian president was calling for dialogue among civilizations. Now, Iran is on the record, including President Ahmadinejad, that Iran does not threaten the use of force against any other member of the United Nations. That is a categorical statement. We've never used force against any member of the United Nations, and we do not threaten to use force against any other member of the United Nations. I have challenged both Israel and the United States to make the same statement, and we will be happy, that Israel and the United States do not threaten to use force against any member of the United Nations. Are they ready to make that? I have challenged them time and again, and they're not prepared to make that statement. Now, if we want to equate resisting occupation of somebody's territory with terrorism, just look at what happened in Lebanon 2 months ago. Use whatever definition that you want. In Israeli attacks against Lebanon, 1,100 civilians were killed, 140 resistance fighters were killed, whatever you want to call them. In the Lebanese resistance attacks against Israel, 80 Israeli military officers were killed and 60 civilians. Now, which one do you call targeting civilians? I don't know why people can make statements that cannot even tally with numbers and then expect the international community to buy that simply because they control certain aspects of the public information and public deception campaign. Now the point is, again, people have made a lot about this. We reject the killing of one innocent human being, be it during Holocaust, be it now. We have the largest Jewish population in the Middle East. And they live not under fear, but they have a representative in the Iranian parliament. Now everybody's human rights can improve and ours can improve too. But the point is, Iran has no history of anti-Semitism, has not ever attacked any Jewish person for his faith. Iran believes that the Palestinian issue can be resolved on the basis of justice, not on the basis of imposition. Now, if people want to impose a solution on the Palestinians, and once it doesn't work out, look for a scapegoat. When they attack Lebanon, and the Lebanese people resist, now look at human nature. Human nature resists occupation. Look at what's happening in Iraq. We all expected this. Although none of us were in love with Saddam Hussein, certainly we were much less in love with Saddam Hussein than those who had supported him in the 80s. But we knew that occupation creates its own dynamics. Now, occupation of Palestine, occupation of Lebanon creates its own dynamics. And those who occupy are the only ones who can be blamed. Don't look for scapegoats. Rhetoric has been on the rise, unfortunately, starting with Israeli officials. Iran's positions on this, again, I want to repeat this, been clear. Pardon me?
So Israel should be arrested or not, or no?
No. You see, what we have said is that Iran does not threaten any other country. Now, one analysis that comes from the ambassador of Israel in Washington is that Islamic regime will be wiped out. This is not only a statement, but an active policy. It's an active policy that is being pursued. Now, another statement, an analytical statement that has been made by the president of Iran is that Israeli behavior is creating the seeds of its own demise. That's a statement of analysis. The practice of a state is what we have stated, and our record is indicative of that Iran does not threaten any other member of the United Nations. I simply ask you, ask any Israeli official, or US official for that matter, to make the same statement. Or unfortunately, ask a British official to make that statement. Of course, that's not too much to say. Threatening another member of the United Nations is a violation of a fundamental principle of international law and of the Charter of the United Nations. And we simply abided by our obligation. But they're not ready to even abide by their obligation because they have been able to violate their obligations with impunity for 60 years. And not a single resolution imposing sanctions on Israel for violations of resolutions, let's say 242, 425, 426, and the numbers could continue, even the ones that escaped US veto, including the one that they vetoed on Saturday.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your call to justice in the world system. I just wanted to, I've got a question that's also not directly related to non-proliferation, but seeing as this is an institution of higher education, I think it's pertinent to raise this issue, and also in light of Ms. Homayouni's opening remarks. Baha'is in Iran, as you know, are denied entrance to universities unless they're willing to identify themselves as Muslim. And as you just described, this is an era where indigenous knowledge in Iran is very important. And I just wanted to know, what is the purpose of preventing talented students from obtaining higher education just because of their religious beliefs?
You call us a theocracy. Based on that, we have established, recognized religious minorities who can have specific rights that are not afforded to Muslims in the United States. That is, for instance, a Christian, a Jew, or a Zoroastrian can perform their marriage, their divorce, their contractual obligations between themselves based on their own canon law. And it's not too much to do because it's an Islamic system and it's not fair. If it was a secular system, then you had secular laws. But since it's an Islamic system, it's not fair to impose Islamic norms, Islamic laws on religious minorities. And that is why we have recognized religions in the country. Now, it doesn't mean that people who are not Muslims and not members of these recognized religions do not have civil rights. But they do not, since they're not recognized religious minorities, they cannot claim to have rights as those religious minorities. In university applications, you're asked about your religious affiliation. You can leave it blank, or you can put one of these religious minorities. And that is how you are guaranteed your civil rights. I believe every Iranian citizen must have the civil right to attend university. If there are restrictions, those restrictions have been done outside the framework of the law. According to Iranian law, every Iranian citizen, regardless of faith, has a right to education, has a right to employment, but you have to be, if you want to exercise your canon law in your interpersonal relationships, then you need to be a member of the religious minority. What I'm stating is the law of the land. Where practice differs, there are injustices that are done to Muslims, injustices that are done to members of recognized religious minorities, and injustices that are done to others. So this may be a case of injustice, but it's not government policy. Government policy is that every Iranian citizen has the civil rights recognized in the Constitution.
Observing the nuclear discourse in Iran and comparing them with its counterpart in the West, I think it reveals a huge discrepancy in assumptions and argumentations, and I think that in your speech was actually a manifestation of my observance. Iran in the nuclear discourse is depicted as dangerous. These are some of the quotes that I got from, let's say, prominent newspapers in the West, including German and American newspapers. Is depicted as dangerous, crazy, radical, defiant, and incapable. At the same time, and this is the other side of the story, Iran sees itself as incapable, is convinced that it shows constantly its will to compromise, depicts itself as a proponent of regional and global peace. So, in your opinion, what are the reasons for this huge discrepancy, and how is the convergence possible, from both sides, Iran and America? Thanks.
That is, unfortunately, we don't live in a world where realities reign. We live in a world where politics reign. And in a world where politics reign, your enemy is always all the bad things, and anybody who's with you is always attributed all the good characteristics. That's the easy answer. I think if you look deeper, and when our former president Khatami proposed the concept of dialogue among civilizations, it meant that we need to change the way we govern. Now, having an enemy has become an easy tool for management of global affairs and of national affairs. We all need enemies to govern. That's the easiest way. And if you don't have one, we will create one. I remember when I spoke to my friends in the university groups in the 90s, I said, beware of the replacement of the red menace with the green menace. Because for some, there is a need for an enemy. And if it doesn't exist, you create it. That's the best way to govern. We need to go beyond that. If we want to move to a world that is easier to govern, with less conflict, we need to go to a world where inclusion is the norm and not exclusion, where you don't need enemies to govern, rather you can work based on commonalities. Now, there are commonalities. Now, there are human commonalities. We all breathe the same air, the environment, every challenge that we are facing, from terrorism to environmental degradation to nuclear weapons. These are global challenges. Nobody can be safe from terrorism. If anything, 9/11 showed that. Nobody can be safe from environmental degradation. Nobody can be safe from poverty, because poverty in the developing world would lead to immigration, will have its own ramifications. So we live in an interdependent world. We have common challenges which require common solutions. Now, Iran and the United States have commonalities. We are threatened by the situation in Iraq. We are threatened by instability in Afghanistan. We are threatened by the rise of extremism in the region. These are serious commonalities, but we have learned to work with each other based on our differences, to fight each other based on our differences, rather than to cooperate based on the commonalities that should make us work for a more serious solution to all these challenges.
How do you see Iran and the United States cooperating in the future in a positive way?
But as I said, there are areas of commonality. Iran wants stability in Iraq. Iran wants democracy in Iraq, and I'm not just making slogans, because if you look at the situation, you see that democracy in Iraq is in our national interest, stability in Iraq is in our national interest. And I'm not saying democracy meaning only majority rule. I'm saying democracy because when everybody supported Saddam Hussein, all the opposition to Saddam Hussein, who are now rulers of Iraq, had to take refuge somewhere. Nobody was providing them with refuge. Nobody was providing them with assistance. So Iran is in a good position. If democracy prevails in Iraq, if stability prevails in Iraq, if people get to elect their own representatives, because anybody who can claim to be true representative of the Iraqi people, one way or the other, has good relations with Iran. And those who came after the invasion of Iraq, who came to positions of power and took antagonistic positions vis-a-vis Iran, you now see their records of their past and present being exposed to the public. So we have serious interest in Iraqi stability, unity, and democracy. Now, if the United States claims to share the same interest, then there are commonalities of objectives that we can work on. But that requires, first and foremost, a change in the US attitude. Because we need to change the attitude that got us to this place. With the same prevalent attitude that existed in Washington, that created this mess, and according to Tom Friedman, you broke it, you own it. It wasn't broke, it was bad. I mean, Saddam Hussein was a ruthless dictator and nobody felt it like us. Now I have to tell you that last Friday I lost one of my colleagues to cancer, and he was a victim of chemical weapons used by Saddam Hussein. He was one of my colleagues in our mission, and he suffered from 10 years of cancer, and then he finally gave up last Friday. So we felt the inhumanity of Saddam Hussein, but that was not the way to deal with him. That was not the way to deal with Iraq. And unless the United States changes that outlook, the same outlook that applies to Iran, the same outlook that applies to elsewhere, it will not succeed in removing this problem, in getting out of this mess that it has created. You cannot change the mess, you cannot resolve the mess without changing the outlook, and we don't see that happening, and we haven't seen the Baker report. We've had discussions, The report is still not out. I think they are still continuing the discussions and investigations. But my concern is, are they going to propose a course change? Or are they simply going to propose bandage remedies? That is, let's just forget about this, let's forget about that, and see if we can somehow, through a miraculous turn of events, resolve the problem in Iraq. It won't be resolved that way.
Thanks. Robert Tuttle with Bloomberg News. This summer, oil prices rose to a record. Part of the reason for that was because of concern that Iran, if faced with sanctions, might either cut oil exports or disrupt shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. I wanted to ask you whether those concerns are justified, and under what circumstances would Iran take action, such as cutting oil shipments or disrupting oil flows?
I'm not involved in petroleum policy making, but let me just give you my 2 cents worth, which certainly cannot be taken for government policy. Iran is interested in maintaining a fair balance in the oil supply. It's not interested in disrupting the oil market. That would be the policy that Iran would want to follow. Now, adventurism on the part of the United States will have its own repercussions. And I think those repercussions will come about without Iran taking even one step. The disruptions in international economy brought about by US adventurism in the Security Council or other adventurism that some people may have in mind, and we all hope that rationality would, at the end of the day, prevail and those types of adventurism would not be even attempted, would have an immediate impact on the oil prices, which would not require Iran taking any steps in order to restrict the supply of oil. But that is my own comments and not the official comments. The official comment must be asked from the Petroleum Ministry in Iran.
I apologize. I know there are a lot of questions asked of the ambassador because of the limited time and Mr. Vitter's time. I hope that we could resume this conversation at a later point. I apologize for the rest of you who were not able to ask your question from the ambassador.